The unlikely encounter. The sky above was the color of smoldering coal, thick with the haze of battle. The planet's harsh landscape seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, its red sand churned and scorched by the violent aftermath of war. Sergeant Marcus Hayes, a seasoned human marine, trudged through the heat, his boots sinking into the soft earth with each step. The landscape around him was a graveyard of broken machines and the mangled bodies of his comrades, as well as the fallen warriors of the alien enemy. The alien world was unforgiving, and so was the war. This was not the first time humanity had faced its enemies in hostile environments, but this battle had been unlike any other. Waves of enemy soldiers, known as the HFY, had come from beyond the stars, and they had fought fiercely for control of this barren world. But now, Marcus was alone, his entire squad wiped out in an ambush. His rifle, now low on ammunition, was clutched tightly in his hands as he scanned the landscape. The heat was oppressive, and sweat dripped down his face, stinging his eyes. The air smelled of charred flesh and burnt ozone, the aftermath of energy weapons and explosives that had turned the once vibrant world into a war-torn wasteland. Marcus was used to being in the thick of it, but today felt different. The silence that followed the battle was unnerving. The din of blaster fire and explosions had ceased, leaving behind only the sound of his labored breathing and the occasional wind that carried the faint, acrid smell of the battlefield. His thoughts were scattered, but one thing was clear: he had to survive. The rest of his squad was gone. Their biosigns had flickered out, one by one, during the retreat. The only thing left was the bitter taste of failure and the grim knowledge that, for now, he was on his own. Suddenly, a faint groan broke through the silence. Marcus stopped in his tracks, his heart racing. He spun around, rifle raised, his eyes scanning the wreckage for any signs of movement. Behind a large piece of alien debris, what used to be a hover tank, he saw it, a lone figure, struggling to rise. The figure was alien, but there was something striking about her. She was tall, with pale green skin that had begun to lose its vibrancy due to blood loss. Her combat suit was tattered and burned, torn at the edges, and below her knees there were only cauterized stumps where her legs had once been. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. It was an HFY warrior, a female. Her gray hair clung to her face, matted with blood and dirt. She lifted her head slowly, and when her icy blue eyes met his, Marcus felt a shiver run down his spine. For a moment, neither of them moved. Marcus was trained to see the HFY as enemies, cold, calculating invaders who had no place in humanity's future. Yet, as he looked at her, lying there in agony, there was something in her gaze that stopped him. She shifted slightly, reaching for something, but there was nothing in her hands but air. Her lips parted, and Marcus caught a whispered curse in a language he couldn't understand. Despite the dire situation, she still had the strength to resist. He lowered his rifle just a fraction, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "Easy there," he said in a calm, steady voice. "I'm not here to hurt you." The alien spat in response, words flowing rapidly in her language, but his translator cracked through the message in its standard translation. "You're wasting your time, human. Kill me or leave." Marcus's mouth twitched slightly at the insult, but he didn't flinch. "You don't look like you're in any position to make demands," he said, stepping closer to her. Her ice-blue eyes flashed with defiance. "I need no pity from your kind." Marcus couldn't help but smirk. "A bit proud for someone on death's door, aren't you?" But as he looked at her, lying so still and vulnerable, something gnawed at him. He'd seen his comrades die in the heat of battle, each one a victim of the war that had ravaged their world. But here was an opportunity for something different, something better. He didn't want to just add another body to the pile of corpses. "What's your name?" Marcus asked, kneeling beside her. His question hung in the air, surprising both of them. She stared at him in disbelief, as though the question itself was a ridiculous thing to ask. "What?" she rasped, her voice weak but sharp. "My name's Marcus. Seems only polite if I'm about to help you." He continued to pull medical supplies from his pack, trying to mask the sense of urgency that was building in him. She gritted her teeth, her gaze never leaving his. "You're insane. My people would never help your kind," she said flatly, though there was a tinge of doubt in her voice now. Marcus shrugged. "Lucky for you, I'm not your people. And I'm starting to think this whole war's been stupid enough without one more dead body. So, why don't you tell me your name? And maybe I can help you out of this mess." The Xethri warrior's eyes flared with something like defiance, or perhaps fear. She didn't want to admit it, but the truth was clear. She was losing. She was alone, and she had nothing left to fight with. "My name is Zyra," she whispered, her voice trained. Marcus nodded and set to work, his hands moving quickly, despite the weight of his decision. He had no idea what this moment would lead to, but he knew one thing for sure: this would change everything. As the blood loss slowed and Zyra's shallow breaths became more steady, Marcus carried her away from the battlefield, his mind racing with the impossible question: what did it mean to save an enemy? The reluctant alliance. The journey through the desert was grueling. The twin suns hung high in the sky, casting a harsh light over the jagged landscape, turning the once vibrant red dunes into a scorching wasteland. Sergeant Marcus Hayes, still carrying the alien warrior Zyra in his arms, pushed forward, each step a silent struggle against the burning heat and his growing exhaustion. His combat suit's service hummed softly, compensating for the extra weight of the unconscious Xethri warrior in his arms. He didn't know why he hadn't left her behind. Logically, it made no sense. She was the enemy, a combatant from a race that had come to Earth with the sole purpose of exterminating humanity. She had killed his comrades, and yet here he was, carrying her through the desert, far away from the rest of the battlefield. The wind howled as it swept across the barren plain, pushing sand into his face. The once clear sky had turned a murky yellow, dust clouds swirling in the distance. It felt as though the planet itself was rebelling against the chaos that had unfolded upon it. Marcus was no stranger to hardship, but the weight of his decision felt heavy, pressing against his chest like the weight of the world. He glanced down at Zyra, her pale green skin now looking ghostly under the hot sun, her face bruised and battered. Her eyes were closed, but the faintest signs of life remained in her shallow breathing. Marcus couldn't help but wonder what had driven her people to such extremes. Was it just for power, or was there something more to this war than he could see? His thoughts were interrupted by the faint hum of a signal coming from his suit's communication system. He paused, setting Zyra down gently against a rock formation and taking a knee to check the readout. It was a faint signal, probably a distress beacon from a nearby human outpost. "I got to find help soon," he muttered under his breath, scanning the horizon for any signs of human presence. But there was nothing, just the endless stretch of sand and stone. As he started to lift Zyra again, he noticed her stirring. Her blue eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she looked disoriented, her gaze locked onto him, her expression one of pure disbelief. You are still here," she rasped, her voice hoarse from blood loss and exhaustion. The defiance that had once burned so brightly in her eyes was dimmed now, replaced with a mix of confusion and exhaustion. She had been unconscious for hours, perhaps longer. And yet here she was, still alive, with a human standing before her as her only chance for survival. Marcus said nothing at first, simply adjusting his grip on her to lift her once more. The weight of the decision still hung over him like a storm cloud, but he pushed it aside. He wasn't about to let her die, if he could help it. "Why?" Zyra asked weakly, her breath shallow. "Why help me, human?" Marcus hesitated. It was a question he had asked himself more times than he could count. Why had he chosen to save her? Why had he bothered to stop and help an enemy soldier, someone who had been part of the very force that had slaughtered his comrades? "I don't know," he admitted, the words coming out more raw than he expected. "I guess I'm tired of the killing. This war, it's pointless. You're just a soldier, like I am. And I've seen enough death to last a lifetime. I don't want to add another body to the pile." Zura's expression was unreadable. She blinked slowly, her gaze flicking to the horizon before returning to him. "You think I care about your reasons, human?" She spat, her voice filled with weak but undeniable venom. "You are a fool to think that an enemy such as me could ever understand your so-called morality." "I don't care if you understand," Marcus shot back, his tone sharp, "but I'm not going to just leave you to die. I can't. That's the difference between us, Zyra." She didn't answer, but Marcus could feel the subtle shift in her body language, the tiniest change that suggested she was beginning to comprehend the situation, not just as a warrior, but as someone who was, for the first time, completely vulnerable. She was no longer a powerful force on the battlefield. She was just another person, struggling to survive in a world that seemed determined to swallow them both whole. The next few hours were a blur of heat, exhaustion, and the endless desert. Marcus focused on putting one foot in front of the other, moving forward with a determination that came from somewhere deep within. But even as he continued the trek, part of him couldn't shake the nagging thought, what had he gotten himself into? As night fell, the temperature dropped rapidly, and the wind picked up. The desert, once a sweltering oven, became a cold, unforgiving wasteland. Marcus finally spotted the ruins of an old structure in the distance, a research station, half buried under centuries of sand. It seemed to be their only hope for shelter. He carried Zyra inside, her weight still a burden on his tired body, but he pushed through. He found a clean corner, laid her down gently, and began setting up the emergency heating units from his pack. The dim light flickered as he worked, casting long shadows across the broken walls. When Zyra regained some awareness, she seemed less combative, though her gaze still held that familiar coldness. She watched Marcus with wary eyes, but said nothing, as if weighing the change in her situation. Was she still an enemy? Or was she something else now? Something more complicated? "You're safe for now," Marcus said quietly, glancing at her over his shoulder as he set up the thermal blankets. She didn't respond immediately, but after a long pause, she spoke softly. "You have no idea what you're doing, human." Marcus glanced back at her. "I'm not trying to change the galaxy. I'm just trying to keep both of us alive." Zyra's eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of something that might have been gratitude, or maybe just acceptance. Either way, the road ahead was long, and neither of them knew where it would lead. But one thing was certain: they were no longer just enemies. They were survivors, bound together by the same harsh reality, fighting for their lives in a war that neither of them had asked for. The next chapter of their story was unfolding, and neither of them could predict what it would bring. The unlikely bond. The wind howled through the ancient ruins, whipping the loose sand into the air and causing the decaying walls to creak with age. The research station had once been a hub of scientific discovery, but now it stood as little more than a crumbling relic of a forgotten time. Marcus sat on a worn crate in the center of the station, his back against the wall as he stared into the flickering light of a small portable heater. The warmth was a welcome reprieve from the bitter chill of the desert night, but his mind was far from at ease. Zyra lay on a thermal blanket across the room, her green skin pale and bruised from her injuries. She was conscious now, her eyes open, though her gaze was distant and unfocused. The silence between them was palpable, thick with unspoken words and questions neither of them had the courage to ask. Marcus glanced at her, wondering how much longer they could continue like this. Two enemies, trapped together in a hostile world, with nothing but survival to guide them. He couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Saving Zyra hadn't been a decision he had made lightly, and as each hour passed, he found himself questioning it more. The alien was still a threat, her people were still at war with humanity, and yet there was something about her, something that made him hesitate, made him wonder if there was more to this conflict than simple survival. "You're quiet," he finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, a frustration he hadn't realized was building inside him. "Not much for small talk, huh?" Zura's icy blue eyes shifted towards him, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak right away, her gaze lingering on the small fire in the corner of the room. The faint hum of Marcus's suit, the only sound in the room besides the crackling fire, seemed to deepen the silence between them. "You saved me," she said after a long pause, her voice rough and strained. "But why? Why would a human risk his life for one of us?" Marcus rubbed the back of his neck, trying to find the right words. He had never been good at explaining himself, especially when it came to matters of honor and morality. "I told you already," he said slowly. "I'm tired of fighting. I'm tired of all the death. We've all lost something in this war, Zyra. I figured we didn't need to add another corpse to the pile." Zyra's lips twisted into a bitter, knowing smile. "And what would you have me do, human? How can I repay you for this mercy? Can I promise you that I won't kill you the moment I'm able? Should I swear allegiance to your pathetic cause?" Marcus's brow furrowed, his eyes narrowing slightly. Her words stung, but he knew they were coming from a place of deep hurt, of disillusionment. He couldn't blame her. She was a soldier, just like him, trained to fight and kill without question. But in that moment, as their eyes locked, he understood something else. They were both pawns in a game they hadn't chosen. "You don't owe me anything," he replied firmly, the quiet conviction in his voice surprising even him. "I don't need your allegiance, Zyra. I just need you to survive. Because, whether you like it or not, we're in this together now." Zyra's eyes flickered with something. Surprise, perhaps, or a fleeting sense of understanding. But it was gone as quickly as it came. She turned her head away from him, her posture stiff, as though she were still trying to keep her guard up. The room fell back into silence, but Marcus could feel the tension shift between them. They had started as enemies, two forces locked in a brutal conflict. But in this quiet ruin, with nothing but the sound of the wind outside and the warmth of the fire between them, the lines between them were beginning to blur. Marcus stood up and stretched, his muscles sore from the long hours of travel. "I'm going to check the perimeter," he said, moving toward the door. "Stay here and rest." Zyra didn't respond, but he could feel her eyes on him as he moved. He didn't expect her to trust him, not yet. Hell, he wasn't sure if he trusted her, but they both needed time. Time to heal, time to think, and perhaps time to understand what had brought them to this point. As Marcus stepped outside the ruins, the desert night greeted him with a cold, biting wind. The stars above twinkled in the vast, dark sky, so far away and indifferent to the struggles of those below. He scanned the horizon, his eyes sharp for any signs of movement, any indication that they were being watched. The human military had already been forced to abandon the planet, retreating to safer zones. The alien forces had the upper hand, and no reinforcements were coming anytime soon. Marcus knew he was on his own, and if he was to survive, if they were to survive, it would require more than just combat skills. It would require something far more difficult: trust. Zyra had said she couldn't understand why he was helping her, and in truth, he wasn't sure he fully understood either. But as the wind howled around him, and the cold set in, Marcus realized one undeniable truth. They were both just trying to survive, and survival didn't have to be a solitary pursuit. As he returned to the ruins, the thought lingered in his mind. Maybe, just maybe, their survival would depend on something more than strength and weapons. Maybe it would depend on finding common ground, on seeing past the war, past the hatred, and realizing that, in the end, they were all just people. Back inside the station, Zyra was still lying on the blanket, her body stiff, but her breathing steady. When Marcus approached, he paused for a moment, considering his next words carefully. "I'll be heading out at dawn," he said softly. "I'm going to try to find a way off this rock." Zira's eyes met his once more, the icy blue gaze now tinged with something closer to acknowledgement. "Do you think you'll succeed?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. "I don't know," Marcus replied honestly. "But I'll try. I always try." Zira's lips parted as though she wanted to say something, but then she simply nodded, as though accepting that there was no easy answer, no simple way to fix what had been broken. Marcus sat down beside her, the fire flickering in the background. For the first time since he'd met her, the silence between them didn't feel so oppressive. It felt like the beginning of something new, something that neither of them had expected, but something that was, perhaps, worth fighting for. Tomorrow, they would face the desert again. But for tonight, they were just two people, bound together by survival and an unlikely, fragile bond into the unknown. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast, unforgiving expanse of red sand and jagged rocks. Dawn had broken, casting long shadows over the barren land. The twin suns hung low in the sky, their rays harsh and unyielding, beating down on the weary survivors below. Marcus Hayes and Zira sat at the entrance of the crumbling research station, the morning chill slowly giving way to the heat of the day. Marcus had slept little, his thoughts heavy with the weight of their situation. The path ahead was uncertain, and every decision he made could mean the difference between life and death. He had spent hours during the night scouring the horizon, hoping for a sign. Anything that might lead him to safety, to the hope of getting off this forsaken planet. But all he had found was the endless stretch of sand and the ghostly remains of ancient civilizations. Zira, on the other hand, had spent the night in silence. Her injuries had been stabilized, but the pain was still there, gnawing at her, a constant reminder of the brutality she had endured. Her legs, now nothing more than cauterized stumps, left her feeling helpless, a warrior trapped in a body that no longer functioned as it once had. And yet, as she sat in the shadow of the ruins, her piercing blue eyes were sharper than ever, watching Marcus as he prepared for the journey ahead. "Ready to move?" Marcus asked, his voice breaking the quiet tension between them. He stood up, adjusting his gear, and preparing to leave the temporary safety of the station. His suit's energy reserves were low, and his food supplies were running out fast. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. Zira nodded, though her expression remained unreadable. Despite her circumstances, she had not once questioned his decision to help her. She had not expressed gratitude, nor had she shown much resistance. Perhaps, she thought, it was better to let the human lead. She had no other choice. "I'm ready," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. She wasn't sure why she had agreed to follow him. Maybe it was because, despite her pride, she knew she had no way out on her own. Her people had abandoned her. Her strength was gone. She had become something less than the warrior she once was. "Good," Marcus replied, offering a faint smile. "We'll move out in a few minutes. Keep close. I'll take point." Zira slowly pushed herself to her feet, her movements slow but deliberate. She had to rely on her arms to support her weight now, her legs useless. Despite the pain, she refused to show weakness. She refused to give Marcus the satisfaction of seeing her in anything less than a fighting spirit. The war had taken so much from her, but it had not taken her pride. At least, not yet. The pair set off, moving cautiously across the desolate landscape. Marcus led the way, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon, looking for any sign of danger. Zira followed behind, her every step a struggle, but she kept her pace steady, determined not to fall behind. The trek was slow, the weight of her injuries pressing down on her with each step. As they walked, the silence between them stretched, but it wasn't as oppressive as it had been before. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a fragile truce that neither of them fully trusted, but both of them had no choice but to accept. After a few hours, Marcus signaled for a stop. They had reached the base of a rocky outcrop, a natural formation that offered some protection from the wind and the sun. The heat was starting to become unbearable, and both of them needed a break. "I'll scout ahead," Marcus said, as he crouched beside a jagged rock. "Stay here. I'll be back in a few minutes." Zira nodded, watching him as he disappeared into the distance. She could feel the weight of their situation pressing down on her again. She had never imagined she would be in this position, relying on a human for survival, of all things. The HFY had always considered themselves superior, their technology more advanced, their soldiers more disciplined. Yet here she was, utterly dependent on someone she had once sworn to destroy. As the minutes passed, Zira sat in the shade of the rocks, her mind racing with thoughts of the war. Her people had come to Earth with the intent of conquering it, but in their arrogance, they had underestimated humanity. The HFY believed in their superiority, in the righteousness of their cause. But now, as she sat here, alone and vulnerable, it all felt like a distant memory. The war had taken so much from both sides, and yet there was no end in sight. Her gaze drifted over the barren landscape, searching for any sign of movement. She had no weapons left, no way of defending herself if something attacked. It was a sobering thought, one that gnawed at her, but she refused to let it control her. Instead, she focused on the moment, on the here and now. There would be time to think about the war later. For now, survival was all that mattered. Minutes stretched into hours as Marcus did not return. Zira's patience wore thin, and her thoughts began to spiral. She had grown accustomed to the harshness of her existence, but this was different. She was no longer the warrior who struck fear into the hearts of her enemies. She was just another survivor, wandering a broken world with nothing but the promise of a fragile alliance to guide her. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps broke her reverie. She turned to see Marcus returning, his face grim and covered in dust. He moved quickly, his pace urgent. When he reached her, his expression softened, but there was a tense edge to his words. "We've got company," he said, his voice low. "A group of scavengers. Human, but not friendly. They've probably been tracking us." Zira's pulse quickened, and instinctively, she reached for a weapon that was no longer there. She cursed herself for not being ready, for not being prepared. But Marcus had already set to work, pulling out his rifle and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. "We need to keep moving," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "But we can't outrun them. We'll have to fight our way through." Zira nodded, her face hardening. She had been a warrior her entire life, and though she had been brought low by her injuries, the fire inside her had not yet gone out. She wasn't sure what Marcus had gotten them into, but for the first time since the crash, she felt a sense of purpose stir within her. She would not be a burden. Not today. "Let's make them regret following us," she muttered, her voice cold and dangerous. Marcus gave her a glance, and for the briefest moment, their eyes locked. Two warriors, bound together by circumstance, about to face a new enemy in an unforgiving world. A test of survival. The air was thick with tension as the distant sound of approaching footsteps reached Marcus and Zira's ears. They had barely enough time to prepare before the scavengers would be upon them. The wind had shifted, and the heat from the twin suns seemed to press in on them, magnifying the urgency of the situation. Marcus's mind raced as he surveyed the surrounding terrain. The rocky outcrop offered some cover, but they were too exposed in the open space between the cliffs. If they tried to outrun the scavengers, they would be caught, no question. But there was another option, one that relied on the only advantage they had left: surprise. "Get behind the rocks," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the increasing sound of footsteps. He moved quickly, pulling his rifle into his hands, checking the charge with a practiced motion. The last thing he wanted was to run out of ammo in the middle of a fight. His suit's sensors were already alert, providing him with a readout of the approaching figures, but he didn't need them. The scavengers were human, and from the way they moved, Marcus could tell they weren't your average soldiers. These were survivors, desperate, and willing to do anything to stay alive. Zira followed his instructions without question, her face grim. She had been in countless battles before, But this felt different. She wasn't the warrior she had once been, and her reliance on Marcus had shifted something in her. The warrior who once feared no one, who once believed her race was invincible, was now at the mercy of a human marine and the mercy of fate. And yet there was a spark inside her, a desire to prove that she could still fight, still survive, even in the face of such overwhelming odds. They crouched behind a boulder, the wind howling louder now as the scavengers drew closer. Zyra's eyes scanned the area, seeking any advantage, any opening that might give them a chance. Her mind raced through tactics, strategies she had learned in the Xethri military, but they all seemed irrelevant in this alien world. The rules of engagement had changed. There was no army behind her, no support. It was just her, Marcus, and the wasteland. "On my signal," Marcus murmured, his eyes narrowing. He could hear their voices now, rough and guttural, the kind of speech that spoke of survival and cruelty. Zyra nodded, her grip tightening on a jagged piece of metal she had scavenged from the wreckage of a nearby vehicle. It wasn't much, barely a weapon, but it was better than nothing. As she prepared to stand, her thoughts flashed back to her home world, to the distant stars of the Xethri Empire, where soldiers like her were trained for this kind of combat. There she had been invincible. Here, in the wasteland, she was just another survivor. The scavengers emerged from the rocks ahead, 4 of them, dressed in torn military fatigues. Their eyes flickered with the hunger of those who had been wandering for far too long. They hadn't noticed Marcus and Zyra yet. The moment was ripe for the taking. Now, Marcus barked. Zyra surged forward, moving faster than she had in days. Despite the pain in her limbs, despite the weakness, she was a predator again, her instincts honed and sharp. Her target was the nearest scavenger, a tall man whose gaze was fixed on the ground, unaware of the danger closing in on him. She swung the metal shard with all the strength she could muster, driving it into his side with a sickening crunch. The man gasped, stumbling backward in shock as he fell, but Zyra was already moving, her next target in her sights. Marcus fired his rifle in quick succession, hitting 2 of the scavengers square in the chest. The sound of gunfire was deafening in the silence that followed, the echoes bouncing off the stone and sand. The remaining scavenger ducked behind a rock, pulling out a crude-looking rifle, his hands shaking with the adrenaline of the fight. Zyra didn't hesitate. She charged toward him, her eyes burning with the fire of someone who had nothing left to lose. The scavenger fired a shot, but Zyra was faster. She dodged, rolling to the side, and before he could aim again, she was on him, pinning him to the ground with the force of her weight. With a sharp, brutal motion, Zyra twisted the scavenger's arm, forcing him to drop the rifle. He screamed, but she didn't care. In that moment, all that mattered was survival. Marcus moved toward the remaining scavenger, who was still cowering behind the boulder. The man's eyes were wide with terror, but he didn't run. Instead, he lifted his rifle, aiming it directly at Marcus. The shot rang out, but Marcus was faster. He dove to the side, the bullet missing him by inches, and fired back, hitting the scavenger square in the chest. The fight was over in mere seconds, the silence that followed punctuated only by the labored breathing of Marcus and Zyra. Marcus lowered his rifle, his heart still pounding in his chest. He glanced at Zyra, who stood over the fallen scavenger, her face expressionless, her eyes cold as ice. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline still surging through him. Zyra nodded, wiping the blood from her hands. "I'm fine," but there was something in her tone, something darker. It was the sound of a warrior who had once fought for her people, but now had to reckon with the reality of what survival meant. She was no longer part of the Xethri war machine, and the world she had known was slipping further and further from her grasp. "We should keep moving," Marcus said, turning his back on the carnage. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed a lingering unease. This wasn't just about surviving the desert anymore. It was about finding a way off this forsaken planet. and finding a way to live with the choices they had made. Zira followed, her steps slower now, as if she were contemplating something far beyond the immediate danger. There was a new understanding between them, one forged in the heat of battle. They had been forced to rely on each other, and though the future was uncertain, something had shifted. They were no longer just a human and an alien. Now, they were survivors, bound together by the struggle to find a way out of this hell. But as they walked, the desolate landscape stretching before them, both of them knew deep down that their journey was far from over. The scavengers were only the first of many threats they would face, and the desert had more dangers in store for them than they could even imagine. And as the horizon loomed ahead, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the true test was just beginning. Shadows of the past. The desert seemed to stretch on forever, an endless sea of sand and rock. The sun beat down on Marcus and Zira, its unrelenting heat a constant companion as they made their way across the barren expanse. The fight with the scavengers had left them shaken, but the brief respite from danger had given them little time to process the toll it had taken. There was no time for reflection, no time for rest. They needed to keep moving, stay ahead of whatever dangers might lie ahead. Marcus could feel the weight of Zira's presence behind him, even without looking. Despite her injuries, she had kept pace with him, though the strain was evident in her movements. The wound she had suffered in the battle with the HFY was still fresh, the blood loss taking its toll on her, and her missing legs made it harder for her to keep up. Yet there was something in her that refused to break. The warrior spirit was still there, buried beneath the physical weakness, still flickering like a dying ember. Zira walked with purpose, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. Her mind, however, was elsewhere. Her thoughts drifted back to her home planet, to the world she had lost, and to the choices that had brought her here, to this broken world, stranded with a human marine in the middle of a war neither of them had ever wanted. She remembered the first time she had been trained to fight. The first time she had been told that her only purpose in life was to serve the HFY Empire, to fight for its glory, to conquer new worlds. She had been young, full of fire and ambition, eager to prove herself. The idea of mercy had been a foreign concept to her, something for the weak. In her world, strength was everything, and the ones who ruled were those who knew no hesitation, no mercy. But now, standing in the desert with a human, someone who had once been her enemy, she questioned everything. Why had she fought? Why had her people fought? Was it truly for the glory of their empire, or had they been driven by fear, by pride? She thought about Marcus, about the kindness he had shown her, and it made her wonder if she had ever truly understood the meaning of strength. Her thoughts were interrupted by Marcus's voice, cutting through the silence. "We're getting close. There's an old outpost not far from here. We can rest there, maybe find some supplies." Zira nodded, though she didn't respond. Her mind was still far away, lost in memories of a past she couldn't escape. She had spent so many years fighting, so many years trying to prove her worth, that she had never allowed herself to question the path she had chosen. Now, in the presence of a human, an enemy, she was forced to confront her own doubts, to face the reality that perhaps the war had been a lie. Perhaps there had been no victory for either side, only destruction and loss. As they approached the outpost, the ruins of a long-abandoned structure loomed ahead, a stark contrast to the endless dunes that surrounded them. The building was weathered, its walls cracked and crumbling, as though time itself had decided to forget this place. The air around it was still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Marcus paused at the entrance, scanning the area for any signs of danger. "Stay alert," he said softly, his hand resting on the rifle slung across his back. "We don't know who might be here." Zira stepped forward, her gaze sharp. She had no idea what kind of place this outpost was or what it had been used for, but she had learned to trust Marcus's instincts. She followed him inside, her eyes scanning the dark interior. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the corners. The silence was oppressive, as though the building itself was a tomb. Marcus moved cautiously, stepping over broken furniture and shattered equipment. The remnants of a long-abandoned life lay scattered across the floor. Discarded food containers, old medical supplies, and the remains of the people who had once occupied this place. The echoes of their lives seemed to hang in the air, ghosts of the past whispering through the cracks in the walls. Zyra's gaze lingered on the remnants of a data console in the corner, its screen dark but not entirely dead. She moved closer, her fingers brushing the surface. She had been trained to use technology, to extract information from machines, and though she was far from home, that training still burned within her. She turned the console on, watching as the screen flickered to life. "What are you doing?" Marcus asked, his voice cautious but curious. "I want to see if there's anything here that can help us," Zyra replied, her eyes focused on the screen. The machine hummed to life, the interface flashing with unfamiliar symbols, but she could make out enough to know that it was once part of a military network, likely human, judging by the markings. After a few moments of effort, Zyra found a set of coordinates embedded in the data, a map of sorts, showing the location of a nearby base. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the map. "This is a military outpost," she said, her voice low, the realization hitting her. "A safe zone. It's a long shot, but it could be our way off this planet." Marcus approached her, leaning over her shoulder to look at the coordinates. "Could it be a trap?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Zyra didn't look up, her eyes still locked on the map. "Maybe. But if there's even a chance that it's real, it's worth the risk." Marcus took a deep breath, considering her words. He didn't want to place too much hope in something that could be nothing more than a mirage, a trap set by someone else. But at the same time, he knew that they couldn't afford to stay here much longer. The desert had already taken too much from them, and they were running out of time. "All right," he said finally. "We'll go, but we stay cautious." Zyra nodded, closing the console with a decisive swipe of her hand. She had always been a warrior, always looking for the next battle. But now, there was something else driving her. It wasn't just the fight anymore. It was the hope of survival, of finding a way out of the chaos and rebuilding what had been lost. As they gathered their supplies and prepared to leave the outpost, Zyra felt something stir inside her, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward.